we'll talk about forensics.
One of our clients is actually being investigated by the US administration.
So hard to distinguish from the truth.
It turned out that someone had faked the air tickets.
The likelihood of investigations is unfortunately going up. But for us, it's an opportunity.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to BDO podcast. And today we have very interesting topic which we'll be talking today. And we'll talk about such interesting service line which people quite often rarely have heard the name, but really don't have a really deep understanding what the services are about. And the service line and the topic we'll be talking today is we'll talk about forensics. And most importantly, we'll talk about international forensics today. And today, here together with me are two honorable guests who know quite a lot about forensics, and they know forensics from two perspectives, from international perspective and also from the perspective that for working for this into this area in many countries, in quite many. And then when I met one of my first speakers, Markus Brinkmann, he gave me impressive number this morning, the number of countries he has worked with for forensic service. He'll tell later on. And also the other speaker I have, Dan Burke, who is also, did I pronounce correctly your surname?
Yeah.
Yes, so I'm glad. Who is working actually for the service line covering international development agencies. Yeah? And he has very also worldwide experience and servicing our BDO clients into this area. So probably the first question I will ask to my speakers, if you can shortly introduce yourself and give us, let's say, and to our spectators, explanation why you're actually doing these forensic services. How have you get acquainted with forensic services? Markus, if we can start with you.
Well, I'm doing forensics now since more than 20 years, actually. And the history is very easy. I was an auditor at the time being, auditing corporates, insurance companies, a variety of stuff. And one day, one of the partners walked in and said, "We have an issue with the inventory of a client. Seems like the inventory is incomplete and things are stolen from the warehouse. We need you to support us." It was more like an accident because I was just there. And then I thought, this is very interesting. And finally, they started engaging me more and more for these kind of projects. And that's why I was so interested in forensics. At this time, forensics was not really known as being forensics. And I did internal audit work, I did forensic work, also statutory audit work. And then I became more and more an expert in forensics. And at BDO, I started building up the forensic and risk advisory services in 2006. And since that day, I'm responsible for the practice, which in Germany now has about 50 people plus. And so it's a very fascinating business. At the time being, I started traveling around for a variety of clients, and I was visiting 70 countries for investigations.
7-0.
7-0.
Wow.
Mostly headquartered firms in Germany, also European institutions, some whistleblower allegations around. And so it's very international work. It's very nice work because it's a lot of added value you can provide. Sometimes you can help the company get the damage back. And so for me it's very fascinating because it includes legal issues, it includes psychological questions, accounting stuff. So it's a lot of different disciplines to be covered, different cultures. So I couldn't think about a more interesting work for me, at least.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about you, Dan?
Yeah, so my work relates to the misuse of funds in the international development sector. So where UN agencies, EU, bilateral aid agencies or private foundations give money to other entities. It could be non-governmental organizations, government ministries, charities, often in a different country. And when potential misuse of those funds is identified, then I and my team will go in and perform a review or an investigation, aim to assess what's happened and provide our client with ideas about how to move forward. So in the context of the development sector, often that means simply our client will consider whether to continue funding the organisation in future or stop funding or try and reclaim funds. And given that the projects take place all over the world, sometimes they're giving money to governments or sometimes they're in a difficult context in terms of the legal environment where judges can be bribed and so on. Often it won't be a formal criminal investigation. So it's more administrative in nature, designed to help the clients with assessing the situation, identifying fraud, potentially reporting that to their donors, which they may have a regulatory obligation to do so, and decision making in terms of how to manage the relationship going forward. And how I got into that, well, I started off my career as a forensic accountant, like Marcus. So I joined an established forensic practice. I also trained as an auditor. I did that for 7 or 8 years and got some really good experience there. Then I moved into the charity world and worked for an international development charity. I did sort of general finance and internal audit functions, but I also ran investigations because we suffered some fraud cases during that time as well. And then I moved to my current role about 8 years ago with BDO. And so I've been exclusively focused on investigations in the sector ever since.
Okay, I have heard quite often the used word investigations. And can I ask you in 2 sentences to try to answer when comes the term forensics for our listeners and watchers of this podcast? Can you answer in 2 sentences what forensics are from your experience, from your daily work perspective?
Well, I mean, forensics means everything which is related to court and to evidence, usually. So you have forensic accounting, you do have forensics in psychology, like for court purposes, you have forensics when you examine dead bodies, for example. That all has one thing in common. This is information or sources used for court and litigation purposes or arbitration if needed. So you need to have evidence in the chain of custody and this kind of stuff. So investigation as such means that you investigate on an issue. It's not an audit, because an audit is always related to a status to be and a deviation between what needs to be and what is. And an investigation is an open approach. That means there is an allegation and you need to find out if this is true or wrong. And then you need to document it and investigate it in a way that in a court case, for example, this can be used as evidence. And then it comes to a forensic investigation.
Okay. Any tips from you?
And from my perspective, in the international development sector, as I mentioned, the cases don't often go to court. But our clients often use the word forensic audit when they describe what services they want. And in the sector, it's commonly understood to mean a detailed review, investigation, or investigative audit. Sometimes they use different terminology as well.
Okay. Since you have had quite a lot of word investigations, but of course the world is developing, business world is developing, financial world is developing. Going back, let's say, to your latest experience, let's put it our region, EMEA region, where you are mostly working in. What are the, let's say, latest fraud schemes that you have been working with and discovering, and probably something interesting, what might be common, interesting to hear for our listeners and watchers?
Yeah, well, we are, let's say, very precisely what we are facing at the moment. We are living in what is called a VUCA world. VUCA means volatile, uncertain, ambiguity, and also uncertainty, of course, as I mentioned already. So the world which you cannot predict. If you look 20 years back, or maybe even 10 years back, it was very clear about the coalitions politically, globally. You were very clear about what was going on. The environment was more or less stable. Now we have a lot of uncertainty coming up. And so what is true today can be wrong tomorrow. So we have wars, we have international conflicts, And why do I say this? And what does it have to do with forensics or investigations? In a world which is unstable, the likelihood of investigations is unfortunately going up. So we do have risks concerning income. Companies may struggle, so people in the sales area, for example, which are remunerated by bonus schemes based on targets and sales targets or revenue, may struggle. So that means all of that, that is my experience at least, may provoke some fraudulent actions in order to get the income. We talk about inflated revenues. We talk about corruption in the sales area, in the procurement area. We talk about a variety of embezzlements. So people are a little bit desperate, want to ensure that they're able to finance their private life, and so on. And then we also have issues which are combined with new technology, like cyber attacks. We have very different schemes now in terms of AI, not only for investigation purposes, also the fraudsters use those. So it's very difficult nowadays to differentiate between a true, let's say, picture and a wrong one, to differentiate between a document which is right and wrong, because artificial intelligence may create even a Teams meeting where a person is speaking and looking like this person without being the person. So that means the one thing is the volatile world, which provokes more fraud in general and more corruption. The other thing is the methodology fraudsters use, and which is really a little bit scaring sometimes, because those fake information, which is really difficult to investigate, is so hard to distinguish from the truth. So those are the two observations I have.
Yeah, but as I hear, these are, let's say, more like economic fraud schemes. But Markus, you touch base very interesting story, AI today.
Right.
Yeah, and the fraud schemes are coming with deep fakes developed by AI tools, different. And of course, forensics should be always step above, to understand how to combat, how to identify all these frauds. If we go towards, like, let's say, fraud detection technology and BDO technology, like thing like called digital forensics, can you share also what BDO is doing as of today, let's say, to discover all these fraud schemes which are developed through technologies, and what technologies BDO is using today?
Well, that's very complex, because so the deep fakes, let's say, are not 100% easy to identify. Sometimes it's very real, but you can do checks of the environment with open source intelligence, for example, and try to identify the whole source of this. On the other hand, and this is equally important, is the technology we use for investigations. So this also changes over time, because the fraud schemes change. So when you had an embezzlement, for example, let's say a few years ago, what happened quite a lot, that like a supplier in the accounting area was fictitiously generated, then the accountant paid some money to his or her own account by fictitious payments and invoices. So, and that was a very common scheme in embezzlement. Nowadays, you have technology, cyber attacks are much more common, technology is much more common, and we on our end use technology to identify fraud. For example, when we do email reviews, let's say e-discovery work, we used to work with search terms on huge, let's say, data sources, like terabytes of data which were processed, and finally the search terms reduced the amount of those to be investigated in deeps. Now AI is supporting us checking which of those documents are relevant and non-relevant for the case, generating ideas and likelihoods for the continuing process in investigations. So technology is efficiently supporting the investigations very different from former times. But it's a journey, so and I think when we look 5 years into the future, we may be on a different development or maturity stage again.
Mm-hmm. And then now the next question I wanted to ask both of you, of course in our regions, and especially when you talk about these development agencies, and as I understood, Markus, you work quite a lot with financial institutions, going back to your career when you started with insurance. All this regulatory environment, which is getting more and more complex, do you believe for our profession, is it a challenge or more as an opportunity?
Well, I can talk about, for example, for financial services. We do a lot of investigations also for regulators. And of course, it's sad to say, but for us it's an opportunity because the risk of violations in that area is increasingly high. And if you look at fintech, for example, which is banks with a very, let's say, robust IT development part, those fintechs usually, without, of course there are exceptions, so without blaming them, but they see themselves more like IT entrepreneurs rather than banks. And they have a lot of challenges with the regulatory environment because the fintechs are usually more innovative companies, more entrepreneurial companies, whereas the classical banks can deal with regulations very well. So I think seeing different industries coming up also within financial services on the wide side and seeing regulation being more and more complex on the other side is giving us unfortunately more work because there's a lot of violations, and regulation is always a driver for investigations and for compliance.
Well, that's a great news for us. Then for you?
So the majority of our clients in the sector are not at all regulated because they're international bodies, like the UN established by charter or international sporting federations and so on. But in terms of the current climate, it is an interesting one. So obviously there's been one of the main donors in the sector was temporarily almost entirely shut down. And a lot of that's been reinstated, but that had an impact programmatically across lots of areas, and other donors I think have tried to pick up the slack, but there's also a general trend in the sector to there's some headwinds in terms of donor funding because there's lots of other things going on in the world at the moment. So it's actually a difficult time in many ways, which will probably increase the risk of fraud, and in a couple of years could lead to lots more cases for me and my team. And one of our clients is actually being investigated by the US administration because they are doing things that are seen as too progressive. So that's an additional challenge for them, and obviously those kind of challenges will impact us as well. So it's an interesting environment to work in at the moment.
Yeah, so then you start to speak about of the future. Yeah, on your both perspective, where do you believe, let's say, imagine next 3 years where the forensic services would be? And what challenges, again, and other opportunities would raise for the profession?
I think in general, they are much more based on technology. In a few years, I think even the methodology we have nowadays will develop step by step. So I think AI will be a component which is definitely there. On the other side, I think that the fraudsters, unfortunately, also using AI, as you already mentioned. And I think on both ends, on the fraudster side and on the investigator side, the improvement in terms of AI will be tremendous. So that means we have challenges to investigate because AI is enabling fraudsters to do things which they are not used to in the past. And we will fortunately also be able to investigate more on an AI-based basis. So this will be a game changer in a way.
What about you then? So where do you see the future of your services?
So fraud has always happened and always will happen. I think there seems to be a bit of a technological arms race at the moment in terms of AI, which will impact both fraudsters and people trying to investigate fraud. But often fraudsters are more agile and able to react quicker, so there could be an increase in fraud, using some of the methodologies that Markus has referred to. And I think also at the moment, a lot of people are talking about rising inequality throughout the world, within nations and between them. So from my perspective in the future, that will raise questions about how we address that, which could lead to an increased scope for grant making and therefore effective and efficient grant making that includes robust methodologies for investigating wrongdoing as well as assurance mechanisms. So it could be in the future that my field of work is much bigger than it is today, but that's kind of based on political decisions that are yet to be taken. So we'll see.
Okay, and you just mentioned these decisions. Imagine that our watchers, listeners are CEOs and board members here. What would be, your takeaway or suggestion or indication why these guys should think, okay, that forensics are important on their agenda today, tomorrow, and what would be, suggestion for them to think about forensics?
I would like to add one component which I did not refer to before.
Yes, please.
And this is compliance management and prevention. So first of all, I think they should be aware of the risks related to their business model and accordingly check if the compliance measures they have in place are adequate and effective. So because the number one thing is to reduce the likelihood. Of course, even so, there will be no 100% guarantee to be not affected. And the other thing I would really recommend is to be aware of what is going on and to identify and detect red flags as soon as possible. And there may be different methodology like whistleblowing, like data analytics, like internal audit work. So I think they need to care about detecting fraud as soon as possible in order to ensure that the damage is not increasing, that they can manage it on the earliest possible stage, because this means a reduction in investigation cost and also a management of the damages in a way that they can handle those. So I think prevention and detection on a very early stage is crucial to at least avoid a severe damage.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually, these preventive measures. Then something for CEOs.
The sector in which I work is a little bit different, but I think some of the lessons that I've learned are that often there can be big information gaps, and that can be where it creates an opportunity for fraud. So I guess understanding areas of your business or operations, understanding cultural differences, expectation differences, where there's a lack of oversight and monitoring. So some of the kind of worst cases I've dealt with have been where there's just someone is kind of handing out money and then forgetting about it and not thinking, oh, we need to pay attention to how the other people are spending this money. And sometimes that does not go well. And further to that, I think that it's painful when an investigation happens or when you have to do forensic type work, but you can also learn a lot from it. And so if you get into that situation and you address it properly, then it can give you a lot of value.
And probably, so we are slowly moving to the end of our discussion, but one thing is probably you have told so many things, but more, let's say, what are the forensics? But can you now just remember, out of your great career, many years, an international career, what was your most, I would say, exciting forensic engagement that you still remember, and you always think, okay, maybe it would be worth to come back to this story, which you went through?
Well, actually it's two, because it's different, but very different, but both is extreme. So the one thing was in Indonesia. I was working for a German corporate, and there were whistleblower allegations there, and the culture in this subsidiary was a mess, and the fraud cases as well. They did everything you can think of. And we investigated that, and you found a variety. Wherever you looked at, there was fraud. It was like tax fraud, corruption in the sales area, corruption in the procurement area, inflated revenue. They did, on a parallel basis, sell the products on their own. And so the general manager was in the center of everything. That means this was really lessons learned for me. The culture was very, very, very bad in this situation, in this specific company, and the company didn't care about compliance more than about performance. So that was the result of that. The second one was a case for a regulator, where we had a huge damage internationally, completely different case, and the challenge was to identify what was the reason for this damage. So it was billions of euros.
Millions.
And billions of euros. And the question was this fraud? Was this human error? Was this a misconduct in terms of a corrupt business model? What actually happened? And so it was a very open question, and to get deeper and to find the reason for this loss was very, very challenging, but it finally came to a very good end. And so it was a international case, it was a banking case in the investment banking area, and it was a exciting project for a variety of reasons. So number one, size, international technology, international teams and subject matter experts. Completely different cases. The one more a mid-sized company with fraud in Indonesia all around. The other a very regulated business with a variety of issues coming up and complexity very high. So those two I will never forget.
Would you like to do it again?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't think the client will, but not because he didn't like us, but he didn't like the circumstances that they had this issue and they had to correct the taxes and things in the first case at least. But of course, from my end, yes.
Okay. Then,
yeah, I always say to my clients, they say to me, "I hope I never see you again." Not the normal client type of.
Same with me.
So there's been lots and lots of highlights, and I think reflecting on it just now is a good question. And I think I've been to lots of interesting places and done lots of really rewarding work. But the most exciting moments for me have been when I personally found something that fraudsters or criminals were trying to hide. So like an obvious example is just simply looking at 3 quotes which are supposed to be from different businesses, and you look at them and they look sort of a bit like each other, as if they could have been by the same person, and then it might be something as simple as going into the PDF document properties and finding out they're all created by the same author, or calling someone who says, actually no, I don't have a real company, I'm just processing the bid for someone else. One of my favourites was when we were reviewing lots of invoices and there were some air tickets, and I started looking through the air tickets and thought, that doesn't quite feel right. And then it turned out that someone had faked the air tickets and they had put in like airport codes that you can find when you search a flight on Google or whatever, but they'd used made up codes that weren't real. So they said the trip from Paris to Rabat was like PAR to RAB when it's actually CDG to RAB or something, RBA or something like that. So picking up on that kind of detail makes you feel like you're, catching up with people who have been trying to misuse funds. But yeah, I think almost every engagement is exciting in one way or another.
Okay. So you mentioned this excitement, and if there are any BDO colleagues watching this podcast, would you say that forensic services in BDO network are the most exciting service line?
Yeah, of course, it's very difficult to judge on the others. But from my end, and this is my personal opinion, yes, because as I said at the very beginning, it includes psychology, economics, accounting, a little bit of law. Of course, we are not lawyers, but we need to work with lawyers. So it's very interdisciplinary. And so it's very complex, and it's also something where you can provide additional value to a company. For me, it is and I may be seen as a strange person now, but also doing forensic interviews, challenging fraudsters with the evidence we found at the very end is a very, very interesting issue, because you see people, how they react, and this reaction may be very different. But on a commercial side, I would say it is a very prosperous business and a growing business, because as we already mentioned, fraud will not go down, but due to the circumstances, the, let's say, uncertainty and the technology on the other side, go up tremendously, and I think our work will be more than enough in the future. So it's a prosperous business and an interesting business. So, and if you have a prosperous and an interesting business, it's always good for development.
Okay. So maybe some last words which hasn't been told, to tell about this interesting profession of forensics experts and experience. You had something else untold, maybe I haven't asked you.
I would like to pick up something which Dan mentioned correctly. I think it's a very volatile business, so it's never a balance between work and people.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's more work than you can handle, sometimes the other way around. That's why we work with international colleagues quite a lot in order to mitigate this volatility. And the other thing is, I think if you only want to work at home on a remote basis, that's the wrong job.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to be interested in traveling and to places which you would not like to be on vacation sometimes. And so the challenge is to understand the environment, to listen to people, to really go into deeps, which is not something everyone likes, but this is crucial for being a professional. And last word in that respect, do not, let's say, be shy to investigate or to, let's say, engage forensics, because in the end, the outcome is very important for developing the company in the right direction.
Actually, today I had very good takeaway. I remember this expression which you mentioned, finding a needle in the haystack.
Right.
Yeah, it raised for me again, that how important this expression is in the profession.
Yeah, you need to efficiently do that, but it's a lot of work. And so if you talk to people who want to be engaged, like a first job or so, they are very interested, listening, wow, forensics, traveling, working, psychology, and all this kind of stuff. And then I tell them also, it can be that in the very beginning you need to go through documents for 4 weeks, or you need to go through emails like for 8 weeks, and do this on a daily basis. And at the very end you may find the clue, and you may find how everything fits together. But to come there is a lot of detailed work. And so it's a very fascinating work, but you need to be very passionate also to survive weeks of, let's say, detailed work in order to come where you need to come.
Then, on your side.
So in terms of a message to colleagues, I think that the initiation of many of the kind of projects I've been involved in has relied on our network. So when someone who's not necessarily involved in forensic work or forensic audit work realises that actually there's an opportunity to pass on a referral internally, so many great projects have come to us, to me and my team, for example, which we're very grateful for, through internal referrals, because someone's having a discussion with a client, the client mentions, I'm not sure about this, or I have a potential fraud case, and then getting that's the right people can create really good opportunities in the network. And you also mentioned sort of general closing thoughts or kind of inspirational experiences, something like that. And I think I had a really good experience being a witness in arbitration proceedings. It was for the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which was very interesting. Just that experience of being kind of cross-examined and preparing and being able to defend your work. And I know Marcus has been in that kind of thing in court cases many, many times, but for me that was a really exciting experience. Yeah.
Okay, so I will say thank you really much for this visit, and we are grateful here for Marcus Brinkman and Dan Berg visiting us here in Latvia, and we really look forward developing BDO forensic services, and I can personally share the opinion. Also, I've been finding a forensics investigator profession most exciting one into this firm, and I was believing, always telling to the colleagues, if you believe that you are ready to take this journey And also for the companies, be prepared for this, doing these preventive measures. Then, that's probably the right time to think about this exciting profession. And remember that forensic specialists might help you always. Thank you for watching you, and see you at the next BDO podcast. Thank you.